Well, hello and welcome to the latest IFSEA podcast and to today's subject, which is a reflection on the so-called smorgasbord budget of the UK Labour government. I'm Merrill April, a partner in CM Murray, and I want to pick the brains of David, Veronika and James to understand the impact of the UK budget on cross-border working in 2026 and beyond. So I'm delighted to have talking to me today some amazing experts from BDO's international tax and employer services teams. So just a quick intro. David, starting with you. David is a fellow IFSEA board member. Thank you for that. And a partner in the global employer services section of BDO's tax group in London. And as such, he advises clients on expatriate tax, employment tax and reward. He has a really deep specialism in expat tax and helps clients understand the impact on international cross-border working. So David, just to kick things off today, what are your top line thoughts on the impact of yesterday's budget on international cross-border working?
Thanks, Mel, and thank you very much for having me here and the team. So I think yesterday's budget was probably, in memory, one of the most highly anticipated budgets in recent years for a number of reasons. Firstly, the uncertainty that was to come. I think that certainly if you've been in the UK or been close to the UK media over the past couple of months, there's been such widespread speculation on some of the major reform potentially coming. That was pretty much going to cover wealth tax, exit tax, changes to long-term revenue sources such as inheritance tax or stamp duty. I think that a lot of that speculation has been tested quite hard and drip-fed to organisations and individuals in the UK over the past couple of months, and that's definitely created nervousness and had a knock-on effect on the businesses protecting what they have. That has affected employer spend and investment, and it's probably held up quite a few business-related transactions. We also have had quite an interesting geopolitical climate in recent months and years. So we've seen overseas government policy become more drastic in change, certainly short-term change without preparation. And I suppose the knock-on effect from a UK perspective has meant what has this budget meant? And even the Bank of England has said that this nervousness has definitely caused the economy to stagnate. For the audience and for those advisors who handle senior exec affairs, whether they work in or out of the UK, we previously saw quite a dramatic 2024 budget with the near abolition of the concept of domicile in UK law. So 2025's budget was unlikely to reach the same level of controversy or excitement for international employment lawyers or tax specialists. There were some notable changes, though, to UK tax law impacting internationally mobile employees and their employers. The first notable change being the freezing of the personal allowances and income tax thresholds to continue the fiscal drag until April 2031, effectively bringing more taxpayers into paying income tax or into paying income tax at higher rates. And that will continue to impact individual assignees' overall tax rates and also employer costs should the employers choose to tax neutralise the individuals who are being asked to work in the UK. We also saw distinct changes to pension salary sacrifice, where there will be the reduction of national insurance relief for employee contributions to an employer sacrifice pension scheme from April 2029, meaning that only the first £2,000 of sacrificed contributions are not subject to Class 1 primary and secondary national insurance. So any amount of salary sacrificed in excess of that £2,000 amount will be subject to national insurance with effect from April 2029. And we will also see in the short term changes to the abolition of voluntary Class 2 national insurance contributions from 6th of April 26. And that is traditionally there as a means of employees maintaining their national insurance record, affecting their state pension and benefit entitlement. And it will be replaced with an alternative form of national insurance, but one that is much more expensive for individuals. I suppose more strategically, the government have announced that they are going to consult on how they develop the UK tax regime further to remain competitive internationally to individuals. They've got their existing immigration reforms, which are effective from November 25, including the high potential individual, the innovative founder, and the global talent visas. But the government stated that they are aiming to support internationally mobile individuals to establish themselves and their associated businesses in the UK. So, what's the message? They want to keep the UK open to business and investment. And in terms of broader initiatives, we've seen UK listed companies are going to be now eligible for a 3-year exemption from stamp duty, meaning that there will no longer be a 0.5% tax on purchasing shares of newly listed companies for up to 3 years after floating. And why is that particularly important? I suppose London has lost out. London's lost out internationally to places like New York for IPOs. And I think if the UK needs to be seen as a great place to do business going forward, there needs to, that is the sort of shift that we need. We need more simpler regulation. We need not as a reduced cost in businesses being ambitious. And we've also seen a strategic focus on supporting scale up business, various initiatives there, helping the grassroots economy. That particularly, I think, will affect individuals who are involved in some of the rising sectors, such as AI, tech, in particular, which is one of the most popular sort of revenue sources now in the UK. And I think something else of interest is that there is also at the same time going to be a stricter adoption towards non-compliance with employers. So more investment in HM revenue and customs, where the government has announced that they're going to enhance HMRC's powers, where there are errors in tax returns. There's going to be a revision to penalty reform, particularly in regard to self-assessment tax returns. And that really, for us as advisors, we we cannot underestimate the importance and emphasis on planning ahead with and not underestimating the employer and employee compliance which exists from doing business in the UK, whether that is an individual working in the UK as little as 1 day to three or 5 years. So I think overall it wasn't as dramatic a budget as anticipated, but for my view is that hopefully this gets things moving. I hope now we can see more transactions in 2026. I think we can hopefully see more inbound activity for individuals feeling more confident to work in the UK. And yeah, so hopefully it's a positive message.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think there's a heck of a lot to take in there, David, and thanks for that. I know we're going to come back to things like the fiscal drag and the salary sacrifice impact and other things, but certainly got my attention when you were talking about greater enforcement. I always think that's the scary, although maybe exciting part of tax. But you also mentioned changes on shares and equity, and I wanted to introduce you, Veronika, at this point. Veronika Lipinska is a management equity, tax and share plan advisor in BDO's London office, and she devises and implements share plans for businesses, and as such often also works with private equity. Many of her clients have an international presence and workforce, and that means that she's often involved in providing international share plan advice, including in the US and the other end of the world in Australia and Europe in between, and Singapore, all of which jurisdictions are represented by RFC members. And I read on your bio, Veronika, that you recently started to develop expertise in cryptocurrency-based employee incentives. So I hope we get 30 seconds to talk about that because that sounds fascinating. But to kick off, in a nutshell, has yesterday's budget been a friend or a foe to the share incentives world?
Thank you, Merrill, for your very generous introduction. The budget is definitely a friend to senior executives and startups and scale-ups in the UK. It's a wonderful budget when it comes to equity incentives, because one of the key things that this budget has done, which was something that was lobbied for a number of years, So this is a very highly awaited change. This budget reformed the tax-advantaged EMI scheme. Now, of course, some of our listeners here will be very au fait with EMI options. A lot of senior executives hold them as part of their compensation package. But for those who have never heard of EMI options, these are tax-advantaged options which allow employees to pretty much realize share option gains at the lower rates of capital gains tax and benefit from the advantaged business asset disposal relief, which, as things currently stand rates-wise, is the most lucrative relief there can be on any type of compensation. So EMI options are very attractive for companies, very attractive for executives, for employees. It's a wonderful incentive, and it's one which has been widely criticized for being unfit for purpose given the passage of time since the time when the scheme was first introduced. So the old rules didn't work for scale-ups. Many companies, and these are the ones that Rachel Reeves wants to incentivize in our growth economy, they were outgrowing this EMI scheme very fast. So the scheme was subject to limits, the scheme was subject to qualifying criteria. Those criteria have now been relaxed. Looking at statistics, you can see that it now takes on average 13 plus years for a UK growing company to list on a stock exchange, to IPO, 13 years. Under the old rules, EMI options would expire after 10 years, which means that they didn't quite motivate and incentivize senior employees, senior management to work towards that IPO timeline. The timelines were misaligned. Rachel Reeves changed those option lifespans to now extend to 15 years. Other changes include bringing the overall employee limit from 250 employees to now 500 employees, which again is a very welcome change because for growing, especially tech business, it's around 250 employees mark when the company specifically needs incentives and specifically needs that push to grow. That's when you stop being a startup, you become being a scale up. So very welcome change. And the asset limit was also relaxed. So it used to be the case that companies can only have 30 million gross assets on their balance sheet in order to qualify. And now this has been extended to 120 million. So as you can see from those changes, the scheme will now allow scale-up companies, those mid-market companies, to incentivize their executives with very tax-advantaged options, which for those advising senior executives, it might be high time to now look at compensation packages and see if there is anything that can be done to maybe restructure some of the existing packages to fit within the EMI framework so that your clients, the individuals, can benefit from the changes.
That sounds amazing. It does definitely sound like a time to dig out the old schemes and review them, because those are some pretty significant numbers that you mentioned. Thank you. And then last but definitely not least, James, I wanted to come back to the employer services side. And James is a global employer services director in BDO's London employer services team, and I understand has lots of UK, US experience. Joined BDO earlier this year and works with private clients and employers to navigate the cross-border complexities that arise for individuals moving in and out of the UK and the US and other countries. It deals with long and short-term moves, non-executive director duties, which we've not touched on much so far, short-term business visitors, international performers, and many others. So, James, many of our IFSEA members and some of our board members are in the US and will be interested in this podcast, I'm sure, but many also in Europe who deal frequently with the US, particularly from France and Germany and Switzerland. This is a really hot topic for them. Do you think that US citizens are going to be more attracted to come to the UK after this budget, or or less, and vice versa.
Yeah, and thanks for the introduction. I think, it's a great question because there's almost a bit of a contrast in what the government have offered through this budget. On the one hand, you have exactly what Veronika was talking about with scale ups and startups looking like they have more opportunity to grow with tax incentives through the growth of the EMI scheme, or what we expect to be a growth in the kind of EMI world. So it's a message that UK PLC is kind of open to business, which is, to steal a political phrase. On the flip side of that, there may be some Americans who are a bit nervous now about the fiscal drag that's ongoing in the UK for another 6 years or so. Because what that really means is, with inflation, you're now seeing more and more of your income being taxed at higher rates in the UK. And when I speak to Americans who come to the UK, they quite often say, well, actually, if I look at what I suffer tax-wise in the US, it's actually quite a high rate if I add federal tax, state tax, and local tax. And people tend to think in terms of what the highest marginal rate is in the US. And they think, well, that's fairly similar to the UK, could even be higher in the US. But the real kind of the real detail that you need to dive into is how the tax bands are affected. And in the UK, what happens is that you reach a 40% level of tax after just 50,000 odd pounds. You don't come anywhere near that in the US on 50,000 pounds worth of income. Typically, you'd have to be around seven figures, earning around seven figures before you start reaching those higher tax bands. And so that typically means if you're earning somewhere between $200,000 to $1 million of income, your UK tax rate on that income could typically be 10 to 15% higher than when you're in the US. Now, that means that you're going to see a lot more employees as more and more income gets dragged into the higher rates in the UK, particularly in 5-6 years' time, noticing that disparity between their take-home pay in the UK and the US, and probably asking for protections in their contracts to ensure that they are not personally suffering the tax cost. The budget from a personal level, from in personal income tax level, is fairly unattractive. But there are areas where it is becoming an increasingly attractive country to live in, and particularly if you're looking to grow your business here, if you're looking to scale it up. And that seems to be the direction of travel that the government are going in. They're trying to make us a more investor-friendly country. And one of the ways that they're doing that is through the kind of changes they're making to ISAs as well. So it's a very small change, but it kind of hints at where the government's going. And that's saying that previously you could invest £20,000 in a tax-free ISA, and that could either be a cash ISA or it could be a stock and share ISA. But in the UK, we tend, compared to Americans, we tend to be very conservative with our investment strategies and our savings. There's an almost implausible amount of UK savings parked in kind of low interest bank accounts. Whereas in the US, let's say middle America, are very much used to having brokerage accounts. They all invest. In the UK, that's quite uncommon. So the government are saying, okay, you used to be able to invest either in £20,000 worth of stocks and shares or in a cash ISA where you get interest free. But now we're going to make sure that if you want to invest 20,000, at least 8,000 will have to be in stocks and shares. And it's partly trying to change the British mentality towards investing. And if they can do that, then it's going to make it an even more attractive place to start up a business here. It's kind of a big ask to actually change the culture in the UK, but it's probably a clever way of starting.
Wow, yes, I wasn't expecting us to end up there. So we've got tax changes, but also potential, as you said, James, changes to contracts, which maybe we can talk about a bit more, and then cultural change, which is a brave thing for any government or any organisation really to undertake, isn't it? So where should we go next? One thing we talked about when we chatted was what the budget didn't do. I think we've probably picked up on some of those things, but is there more to be said about what we thought might have been going to happen and didn't happen?
Yeah, thank you. I think there was quite a lot of nervousness about um, individuals who have the flexibility to be placed wherever they want in the world and whether they genuinely choose to still remain to do business in the UK. And something which was certainly a bit of a cloud over that would have been the idea of an exit tax, um, because the UK is still, in the context of in the global context, it's a sophisticated and thriving economy. We've obviously, I think that we are unfortunately in an economic downturn, but these things do come in cycles, and we've seen that historically. So what I would hope is that there is more confidence now in individuals wanting to be placed in the UK as a result of some of the potential threats that were looming now not existing. So, what does that mean? It means that I think hopefully senior executives will feel comfortable having the UK as a good revenue stream. Um, the idea of what we certainly saw in the pandemic was the idea of the displaced workforce, where effectively, if all you need is a headset, a laptop, why can't you just work anywhere in the world? We've definitely, I think that the UK is still a strong place for the talent deployment. And so essentially, this is all really leading to, I think, what we hope in Q1 2026 is just an uptake now, just a bit more activity, a bit more. We might see more mergers and acquisitions. We might see more confidence in spend. And I mean, there will be another budget coming up in spring of next year, but it always tends to be the autumn budget in the UK that puts in place the more drastic changes or the more significant changes. So yeah, and I think overall, what our view is for anybody who is listening who works with senior executives, there are still some quite interesting tax changes that are in effect. The foreign income and gains regime, for example. Um, there are tax concessions that are in place, such as detached duty relief. And to James's point earlier, I think overall the you will gain a lot through planning ahead, through talking to taking advice before starting work in the UK to understand how to optimize net pay, employer compliance, employee compliance, and effectively to mitigate one of the huge complications of working in one country and another country is being subject to double taxation at the same time. So understanding how you can potentially mitigate that, whether that's in the UK or overseas, is really, really important. And what we have seen as a general trend is the environment has become more cost conscious. So employers who with some of these changes now that have been put in place, particularly in regard to national insurance, um, advisors should be in a place where they can help employers anticipate and estimate the cost of mobilizing people into the UK, whether that's in 1 year, 2 years, three, and beyond. And I think that we found that as a trend a bit more of a, so I want to know, the question for us as advisors has been, so thank you for your advice. This is all very interesting. But I want to know what the cost of the business is. And that's something we've certainly seen an uptake on. I think we're still going to see that because that will have set a precedent. And the change will be obviously what did yesterday mean for those kind of cost estimations. And I think we'll see that on the NIC side.
And is that going to be easier to do, those cost estimates, or?
That's a really
I'm
good
not sure
question.
yet.
It's something I think James and I have got into the habit of asking ourselves weekly. I mean, going back, I'm seconding somebody, maybe to the UK or another country, but I'm going to keep it quite traditional. They're going to be leaving the home country, maybe the US. They're going to be working in the UK for quite a long time. There will be maybe a 3 year secondment period. There might be some significant benefits attached to that, such as allowances, support with family moves, moving goods, extended medical insurance, obviously help with the immigration. And this was very costly. To then what we saw with the pandemic as a trend, which was very much a displaced workforce, where we saw a split between business mobility and then personal mobility. Although as personal as it might want to feel, it's still an employer obligation to look into that. An overseas tax authority and HM Revenue and Customs in the UK would simply see it as if you've got an employee here, that's a tax presence you have as an employer associated potential payroll, potential social security, but your job is to get that right. So we do see that falling short still, I think, because this is not widely publicized advice. It's quite hard to navigate this specialism. And then what we've seen since the pandemic has been just such a increase a in cross-border working splits. So certainly well away from the kind of 100% of time in one country for a set period of years to then, the personal, the business moves to now what we see is basically 50-50 splits between countries. We see a lot more business travel. That definitely creates more complication. And to answer your question, when we do those projections of cost, we have to take into account not just the costs of doing business in the UK, but they want to see the global cost of doing business because compliance will not just arise in the UK, it will arise in the other country as well. And it is helpful because what the benefit of doing that is by allowing employers to look at this up front. They can decide what policy to apply to the senior execs or the individuals moving, and they can understand what the full costs are as well. And something that Veronika has mentioned previously is it doesn't just simply end with payroll and a social security certificate. Um, there is extensive and complex employer reporting, certainly if equity is involved as well.
Do you want to come in on that, Veronika? That would be interesting to hear
Yes,
about.
I mean, so many interesting points there from David. I mean, in terms of some of the things that haven't happened, which we thought might happen, which David mentioned is definitely exit taxes, which would be very difficult to manage from equity perspective. We do see some countries like Singapore that have exit taxes, especially in the context of equity, and they are very practically difficult for employers, for executives to administer when executives go to Singapore and they vest equity and then they go to another jurisdiction, say the US or France, and they crystallize dry tax charges on unrealized assets. That's definitely a hit no one expects and no one wants. So, very welcome change that exit taxes didn't change, but also a very, very welcome thing that hasn't happened is the increase in CGT rates. So I think the three of us, as we sit here, we were expecting at least a marginal increase in the rates of CGT, capital gains tax. So capital gains tax is the tax that essentially taxes equity when gains are realized. It is at lower rates than income tax, but over time, governments have been increasing the rate, but capital gains tax and the annual exempt amount have stayed the same. And also the very lucrative business asset disposal relief, which attaches to private company shares, which many of the executives might hold, that also wasn't reduced in any way, shape, or form, despite the fact that many successive governments have been chipping away at the relief. Obviously, that's in the context of this budget happens a year after a budget, which was a very drastic one, especially in the context of many businesses are still feeling the increase in employer NIC going from 13% to 15%. That has caused a lot of small businesses to go out of business. That has caused very substantial increases in business costs for employers. So what was implemented last year is still bedding in, and it's still having ripple effects. So in a way, you might say some of the things that haven't happened, they haven't happened because of the last budget that revolutionized tax rates elsewhere in the code. So I don't know if James, what do you make of the things that didn't happen?
Yeah, I find it really interesting in that we obviously we come face to face with clients every day who are considering what a budget is going to bring and making decisions off the back of that. So David said earlier that it's kind of stagnated the UK economy a bit. But more than that, we face clients who tell us, in the last 2, 3 weeks building up to this budget, that they potentially want to move themselves and their family out of the UK because of all the speculation they've been reading in the papers. And there are live cases of people doing that. And there's kind of a salient lesson, not just for the government there, in terms of drip feeding speculation has a real effect on the economy. There's also a salient lesson for us as taxpayers, which is that we need to ignore some of this speculation because guessing up front what's going to happen is quite often a bad move. And one of the reasons for that is that governments nowadays, well, certainly since Liz and Kwasi's disastrous budget, they've realised don't go in for big ticket change. Instead, do what Veronika was mentioning with capital gains tax, which is incremental change. So incrementally building up the rates of tax on certain types of income. So we've now seen it with savings income, dividends, and even on rental property, it's going up 2%. So you're not likely to see these big fear stories you hear in the press are unlikely to materialise because it's too destabilising for the British economy. But what you have instead through incrementalism is kind of like boiling a frog. You don't really notice until 5, 6 years later that you're paying a significantly higher rate of tax than you were previously, and than what you are potentially in other countries. So how should an executive think of that? Well, if they're outside the UK at the moment and they're thinking, oh, should I move to the UK? And they get scared of hearing all the scary stories from the budget and what is being predicted, you can probably ignore most of that, famous last words. But you can then move to the UK with some confidence that with the FIG regime, which exempts your non-UK income, your non-UK investment income from UK tax, that can be used for 4 tax years in the UK before it disappears. So if you only want to come to the UK for a 3 to 4 year period, you're probably protected from a lot of this incrementalism. And even if you have UK investments, you're not going to get that big ticket hit. You can probably leave and it's only a short term, you're only going to be suffering short term increases in the tax rate in the UK. So as long as you know up front what that tax cost is and it's palatable up front, it's probably only going to marginally shift over the next few years. It's probably the rest of us who live in the UK long term who are looking at it going, oh, actually now this is starting to constrain our spending power. But I think it was interesting what was left out given the scale of what was predicted.
It really was, thank you. And you giving the image of the boiling frog makes me think of the other image of yesterday for anyone who actually watched the budget speech, and our deputy speaker who was constantly left going, simmer down and breathe. But maybe that is a good advice to all of us in these situations. But
I think, sorry, Laura, I think that's a good point, because actually the speaker got involved before the budget probably more vociferously than I've ever seen before. She actually gave the Chancellor a dressing down. And it was partly over the release of details that were actually going to be in the budget early. She said this should be debated in the House first. but she also dressed her down generally over a change in how budgets are conducted in the UK, where everything's drip fed through the media over 30 to 60 days. And I think she was really focusing on the fact that this has been hugely destabilizing for the UK. And the real beauty of getting this budget over and done with is we can actually now progress with a bit of stability for the next year at least. And that is attractive as well.
It is really attractive. I was interested in what you were saying about clients' expectations of us. I don't know if it's the same for tax advisors as lawyers, but obviously we like to stick to certainties. And of course, you get clients say, well, I'm coming to you for your expertise and your experience. So, what's your best guess? And I think we always hate that question in some ways, don't we? But I'm not going to let you off the hook, because I would like your best recommendation, let's say, as to one thing. You could either pick it from the global business perspective, or from the senior exec perspective. One thing that either a global business should consider or a senior exec should consider when they're thinking next week or the week after about global expansion or about their own personal plans, as you've said, James, in this new context of slightly more stability. What would be your advice, David? I think. Do you want to go first?
I've definitely got an observation about the senior exec population when there is advice from on their behalf, right? So quite often, senior execs are obviously quite tenacious individuals, and there seems to be a bit of a trend in seeking advice on their own behalf in regards to UK tax, where they want to understand the full implications for themselves about becoming either non-resident in the UK or resident in the UK, thinking about their interaction with how the UK tax is potentially offsettable against overseas tax, and that's good. But I find as advisors we often have to educate them on the fact that it's not just about themselves, because their employers or associated companies equally have an obligation to understand both the employer and the employee compliance. And so it's not quite as clear as a kind of divide up exercise, because, for example, if income tax is due in the UK, that obviously will be a personal issue for the senior executive, but the employer needs to understand whether they have an obligation to facilitate the payment of that income tax to the authorities. Likewise, with Social Security, there is an employer and an employer side to Social Security, be that in the home country or national insurance in the UK. And when we talk about senior executives, we're talking about people generally who are in positions of authority to perhaps conduct and conclude business. And so one of the most important aspects not to miss is whether their presence in the UK gives rise to something called a permanent establishment, which essentially is the extension of the business that they're working for in the UK. And if that is the case, what that might mean is that there is either a transfer pricing implication, which again comes back to the company for them to seek advice on, or that there is a potentially even a a payroll obligation as a result of a so-called office being created in the UK, and that can have wider corporate tax implications. So, I mean, the bottom line for me is when we on occasion do get senior execs who just want to find their own advice, aren't interested in what the employer wants because that's their problem, but actually what we have to retaliate with it almost is a view of, well, your employer should be really quite interested in this aspect because it is their obligation to take the lead on this. Of course, if the individual hasn't done something like filed their own self-assessment tax returns, that will be an inquiry into the individual. But quite often, for the loss of income tax where PAYE or payroll in the UK is due, it's going to default to being the employer's liability. So it's a long-winded way of saying, I suppose, make sure that the individual and the employer are involved in all angles of the advice.
Whenever I'm advising senior executives or companies that employ them, I always set the scene by saying equity compensation is one of the biggest ticket items for you as an individual. And if the company goes through an exit or an IPO share sale, those can be life-changing amounts to you. So employee share plans, management equity is something that forms a huge part of one's compensation. If you look at companies such as Revolut, some of the bigger fintechs, they're publicized accounts of individuals who are able to repay their mortgages based on selling the shares in the secondary round. They can be some really life-changing amounts to employees and to executives. So look carefully at how the equity is given to you. When you go abroad, if you're internationally mobile, don't assume that just because your equity is tax advantaged in the UK or if it's tax advantaged in the US, that your tax treatment will follow you to the jurisdiction you're going. Protect yourself in each jurisdiction you go to. Take prior advice. I can't stress this enough. I'm looking at David as I'm saying this because David is also a big proponent of forward planning. Take advice in relation to all forms of your compensation. A lot of people get focused on maybe their bonuses. Equity, don't forget equity.
And I see that a lot in our legal practice. People come way too late when something's gone wrong or is about to go wrong and have no idea that when they moved countries, they should have taken advice at that stage. So if people don't remember any other thing, they should remember that. Thanks, Veronika. James.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be very boring and kind of reiterate the message from Veronika and David, really. We have heard from the budget that HMRC are increasing their powers in investigations. And what you're finding is a very high tax UK society at the moment, tax at the highest rate on record, in effect. And when that happens, fairness within the tax system becomes absolutely vital politically. Everyone's, people's kind of acceptance of someone getting away with paying less tax than they should have, it certainly decreases. So HMRC's increased power, the government's determination to close the tax gap, i.e. the amount of tax that's slipping through the system that they should have recovered that isn't coming in, it's going to see a real uptick in audits, I imagine, which really increases the need for that upfront planning, getting things right from the beginning, and also just knowing exactly where you stand so that going forward, you're entirely compliant, both as a company and as an individual. So yeah, as I say, it's a little bit boring, the message, but it's hopefully it's a sensible message. That's the main thing.
I don't think it's boring at all. I think what I've picked up from today, and I'm really grateful to all three of you, is just how complicated and how interrelated all these tax issues are. And therefore, it obviously does make sense to plan ahead and get advice and to get jurisdiction-specific advice and to come to people like you who have that overview across the globe is just invaluable. But also I've picked up that by and large, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, that this does appear to some extent to have steadied the UK ship, to be a budget which at least produces a platform which may yet produce the growth that the government seeks. And hopefully, as you said, David, stimulate M&A and maybe even IPO uptake, which would be fabulous for the UK. So thank you very much again for your time and all your inputs, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.